Hello, welcome to SQL Bits 2020 in London. This is Rob Sewell talking about Azure SQL Database users and giving permissions with Azure DevOps and service principal names. Not easy for me to say. So here's a slide which makes it look a little bit easier. Creating Azure SQL Database users programmatically with a service principal using Azure DevOps. My name's Rob Sewell. I'm a consultant. I'm a data platform and a cloud and data center management MVP. And most importantly, you can find me on Twitter at SQL DBA with Beard. Please feel free to get in touch, ask me questions. I'll always be happy to answer questions. That's the end of the slides. So that's a good start. So let's talk about Azure SQL Database. And one of the things that we can do with Azure SQL Database is create it programmatically using infrastructure as code. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you this pipeline. We've got one here called deploy elastic pool, and I'm going to run that. So right now, if we look in the portal, we're going to look at SQL databases. There aren't any SQL databases. This is my pipeline. We can look at some of the history. In fact, I think what we might want to do is approve it. So one of the good things that we have within, let's press approve. One of the good things that we have within Azure DevOps is the ability to provide all of the business process that we want for creating infrastructure, if that's what's required. So quite often I will build pipelines for clients that enable them to make changes to infrastructure, but allow their change management team or their CAB boards to have proof of any testing, understanding what the change is, and the ability to be the ones that actually say, yes, go, or no, stop. We can provide that within Azure DevOps and bring all of those processes within one tool that everybody can see. So if we look at the history of this, you'll see there are some cancelled ones, but we'll see that there are some ones that have run and they've taken 20 minutes or so. So I'm going to leave that running. Whilst it does, I'm going to show you the code that we use to create it. So here is my elastic pool repository. And if we look at this Sewell's deploy YAML, this is literally not just the infrastructure, but also the pipeline that we are using to deploy our Azure DevOps. If we were to go back to Azure DevOps and edit this pipeline, you'll see it's just made up of some YAML. That enables us to put in some variables for our pipeline run, some triggers. So this particular pipeline is going to trigger when the branch includes master and when the path excludes the permissions directory. And we'll get to see later why that is. And what else it does is it does a number of steps. So I'm going to press Control K, Control 0, and that's just going to fold all of my code up so that we can see what we've got. We've got our production deployment, and it's going to run in a pool. So this is going to run on a hosted agent. So Microsoft provides hosted agents of various operating systems and with various capabilities. This is the one with Visual Studio on it. And I put a demand of Azure PowerShell because I want to make sure that we have Azure PowerShell. And then this pipeline is going to deploy, and it's going to do a few steps. So the first step it's going to do is going to check out the code that we've got within our repository. And then it's going to deploy a resource group and a storage account for our Terraform state. So we're going to use Terraform to deploy our Azure SQL Database, but because we're using infrastructure as code, because we want our deployment to be idempotent, Terraform needs to know what the state of the deployment is, and it uses a file to store that. Because we're running in Azure, we need to have somewhere in Azure to be able to store that file. So we're going to have our service principal name, and we're just going to run an inline script. And it's going to create a resource group, it's going to create a storage account, and it's going to create a container. And you'll see that we've got some variables here. This is how we call our variables within Azure CLI, and the variables are defined up at the top of the file. This Azure CLI call will create the file, the group and the storage account if it's there or if it's not. It will just carry on running. And same with the storage account and the container. You'll also see that I've got enabled false because I've already created this resource group and storage account, so I don't need to waste my resources running this again. But I leave the code in there so that if I do want to run it, I can just change that to true, check my code in, and my pipeline will run. Once it's done that, the next thing we need to do is we need to get our storage key so that we can Terraform can read the file and grab the state back to make a comparison. Is the code that you've sent me different from the state that I know about? And what are those differences and how can I make it right? So this is important to understand because if you make a change in the portal or in a different way, Terraform doesn't know about it. And when you run your pipeline, you might find that something breaks. It probably won't break if you've only ever used Terraform to interact with this resource. But if you have changed that and used Azure PowerShell, Azure CLI, just the portal to make a change in there, then your infrastructure as code, your DevOps pipeline might fail. So this storage key is just, again, Azure PowerShell task, and it's going to use get Azure RM storage key for this resource group and this storage count and set it to a variable. And then we're going to use this magic bit of code here, and that is going to set the variable to Terraform storage key and also to the ARM access key. This is how we convert our variables into something that can be used in future tasks within our pipeline. So the next thing that I want to do is I want to use Key Vault to store my secrets. So if I look at this, we'll just make sure, yep, everything's running. That's good. We have got our secret from Key Vault, and now we are applying. So you can see here, if I zoom in a bit, that our storage account has been created. Our SQL Server is still creating. So that's a good sign. If we look in the portal and we look for Key Vaults, we'll see I've got a Key Vault and I can store some secrets in. So some of them are for my DevOps And one of them here is very important, my SQL Server admin password. Now, if I look at the networking for this Azure Key Vault, it says private endpoints and selected networks, and we have some firewall rules. Now, one of these firewall rules will be for this agent account, because the agent IPs that are available and are published by Microsoft, there are too many to add into the firewall rule, and they keep changing. So that's some maintenance that we don't need there. So what we do is we get our IP address of our agent, and then we just add ourselves a firewall rule to our Azure Key Vault that says, let my agent connect, please. So that's my connectivity piece. Let my agent connect. And then the very last task that we run says, remove this firewall rule. And again, we're just running some Azure CLI, but this task has a condition of always. So no matter what happens to any of the previous tasks, this last task will always run when the job runs. So it's always going to remove this firewall rule after it's finished running. We also need to make sure that our SPN, our service principal name that's running our DevOps pipeline, has permissions within the Key Vault, not only to read the secrets, but also to be able to add a firewall rule. Once we've added our firewall rule, we can then get our secret. This is our Azure client secret. That's for our Terraform to be able to run and gather information. And we're going to set that to the Azure client secret variable. Next thing is a replace task. This replaces variables in the Terraform files. Wherever I find a double underscore and then another double underscore, just replace it with my variable name. I'll have a look at the code for that in a second. Very important task, this one. Most often it's going to be enabled false. But this enables me to list the file contents. Because we're dynamically creating some of this infrastructure as code, sometimes stuff doesn't quite work as you expect. So I've got a task here that's just going to grab me the content of these files and show me what they are, particularly my Terraform files and my vars files. Then we use some Terraform. So with Terraform, what we need to do is we need to initialize our Terraform. Then we need to create a workspace, a place for us to work. That enables me to have different environments. We've only got production here. But for clients, I'll often create a dev workspace, a test workspace, a UAT workspace, a pre-prod workspace, and then a production workspace. So we can enable our infrastructure changes to follow through this path and also to run any unit tests that we need to do through those. Once we've created our workspace, we've got a continue on error true there. And that's because if we've created a workspace already, then the Terraform code will just error. So this is saying, actually, if you've already got something, that's fine, just carry on going. Because I've already created my workspace, again, I've just disabled this task by using enabled false. But I leave the code in there. And we select our workspace. Once we've selected our workspace, we then plan our build. Go and get the state out of where state is stored, compare it to the code that we've got, tell me what you're going to do. And then finally, task that was running when we looked at the pipeline, we've got our apply task. And this says those changes that you've got, apply them. Now, one thing you can do is create a plan file and then pass that into the next test. I just leave it to run because we've got no approvals in between in this particular pipeline. We're just going to go straight through. If we come back, we're still applying. But if we look at our plan history, you can see that what it says is an execution plan has been generated and is shown below. Oops, wrong one. And it's going to say wherever we've got a plus, we're going to create these resources. So it's going to create a whole load of resources. See where we're at with our apply. We're still creating our SQL server, but we are moving forward. So this is good. If we have a look in our portal, look at our resource groups, we now have a resource group. We've got a network for our Azure SQL Database, and we've got our audit store already created. So those are going to carry on creating in the background. So this is our pipeline. This is how we are going to deploy our changes. Look at our actual changes. So we've got two parts to this. We've got a main Terraform file, and we've got a variables Terraform file. So again, Control-K, Control-0, we're going to fold all of our code. And you see we've got a lot of variables here. So every variable that we're using, we need to define. And these variables will say things like the list of service endpoints to associate with the subnet, or the SQL Server private service name, the log analytics workspace. And up at the top, I've got this variable called environment config. And this is a type of map. And it has, in this scenario, 3 different choices. So you see dev, test, prod. And in prod, I've got all of my variables. Didn't realize it was going to fold on the hash sign. So we've got our variables. So if I'm going to choose prod, which is matched to my workspace name, then we're going to use these variables for defining our infrastructure and running our pipeline. So be it elastic pool prod, that's our resource group name. You saw that that was created. If we look at our SQL audit storage account name, that's called prod SQL audit store. So again, something that's being created. I also have a variable called tags. And again, these map to the environment because we might want different tags for different environments. And we might put things in like in the environment that we're doing, the cost center, the owner, which project it's related to, all of those sort of business type things. Azure tags are really good for budgeting and for accounting, for assigning resources, understanding who's got that sort of reporting tooling. But I'll quite often put a tag that says something like this: do not change me in the portal. These resources are controlled by the Terraform in the repository located here. And any changes that you make in the portal will break the CI/CD process or be overwritten. So again, you try to make sure that should somebody come into the portal and think, I'll change this resource group, at least at the top, we've got some information that says, don't do that, please. We're doing this in a different way. We've got infrastructure as code, so we're going to make sure that this works particularly how we want it to. And look at our pipeline. Ta-da! Our pipeline is finished. Excellent. Everything is green. This is awesome. Now, if I refresh this, so you can see we've got 1, 2, 3, 4 SQL databases. We've got an elastic pool. We've got a network interface and our private endpoint all magically created with Terraform in 16 minutes or so. So the main work happens in our main TF Terraform file. Up at the top, we set up our Azure provider. Say we're going to use Azure. This is the version we want to use, and this is where we've got our subscription ID. So we pass in from our variables in our pipeline. This is where we define our backend. So where is our state file? And we pass in our resource group name, storage account name. It's a Terraform container. And the key is the name of the file. If we have a look at the file, go to our resource groups, bit of Terraform. Here's our storage account. There's our Terraform container. And you can see we've got elastic pool.tfStateInf. And it's got prod because this is our production workspace, our production environment. If we had test or dev, then we would have different state files, but we're still using the same code and the same pipelines. Remember, we had our variables in a map. What we need to do is just map those to a local variable, just to make the code a bit simpler. So we say grab the environment config depending on the workspace, and then set all of the variables to match what's in our variables file. And we say, remember we had our SQL Server admin password stored in Key Vault. Well, Terraform needs to be able to go and get that, pull it back in. So one of the reasons we need our firewall rule to enable our pipeline to be able to go and get the secrets from the Key Vault. But now here we need to tell Terraform where they are. So we create a data resource and we say this is where our resource group is, where our Key Vault is. And say, please go and get me the Azure from Key Vault, the SQL Server admin password. Use the ID from this data resource. Then we just define the infrastructure we want to create. So we'll create a resource group, if it exists or not. We'll create ourselves a SQL Server. So you can see we define a name, we associate it with our resource group name and the resource group location, which version, we give it a login name. Here is our password, which we get from Key Vault. Going to have public network access enabled. Going to have an Azure AD administrator. This is really important. I got this set to the SPN that is running this pipeline because we're going to deploy our permissions with that. This is a very important point. Whether you build your SQL Server with Terraform or whether you do it in a different way, if you want to be able to assign permissions to Azure Active Directory accounts, your SQL Server must have an identity within SQL Server. We're going to do this in Terraform by creating this block, identity system assigned. We had our tags. We got our firewall rule to allow my IP through. We're creating it as an elastic pool. We can put in our SKU, what sizes we want, how much capacity we want to set per database. And this is really cool because now when we're testing, if we need to increase our resources, we just make a change to a variable, commit it, push the pipeline up, and let Terraform do its thing. And you can have developers come to you and say, oh, this hasn't got enough resources. We need some more. You go, okay, project manager, are you happy to pay for more resources? Yep, great. Make a change, check it in, boof. 10 minutes later, it's all done. It's really, really cool. It's how we define our databases, put some auditing policies in place. And this is how you go through and set up infrastructure as code with Terraform to build that. It's really quite simple. You just keep going through and adding in what is the name of the private endpoint, where the location is, which resource group name you want, which subnet ID, add our private service connection. How do we work out how to do this? We take the name of a resource, take this one, and we then say Terraform. I frequently type Terraform and put in the name of the resource. You'll get to the documentation, and documentation is really good. This is the Azure RM private endpoint, and you can see it gives you all of an example and references for all of the blocks and values that you want to put in. And then on the left, you can see, this is, maybe I want to do something to do with auditing. So authentication. What else have we got here? Express route authorization. We can just go and find out how to do it. And that's how you build up your Terraform. Okay, so once we've done that, the next thing we want to do is connect to our instance. So we'll open up Azure Data Studio and we'll create a connection. And I'm going to connect to the master database on my new instance. Oh, okay. I'm not going to be able to do that because I don't have any permissions at all. Okay. Let's come back to here and let's open up a file and we will open up adding permissions. So now we want to be able to connect to our Azure SQL Database, but use the SPN. Because remember, the SPN has got the permissions. If we look at it in the portal and we look at the SQL Server and we look at the Active Directory admin, then the Active Directory admin is my SPN account. So that is the one that has the permissions to be able to give Active Directory users permissions on my SQL Server. So if I set myself up some variables, before I ran this, I had to connect to my Azure my Azure account and set my subscription name. Now I can read the key vault as well. So I'm going to get my service principal GUID, which I've stored in key vault as a secret value. And I'm going to, as a secret value text, which means it will come out in clear text. And my service principal secret, which is going to come out in encrypted text. And I'm going to create a credential. And I also need my tenant ID. I'll run those. And once I run that, I can now use dbatools. And if I run this line of code, I connect to DBA instance name we've provided, database master. We've got our credential that we created here, and the tenant ID and trust server certificate. This is an important flag we need to add onto that. Now that I've done that, I can now run SQL against this instance, be it Elastic SQL. There we go. I'm running this as the SPN. So even though I couldn't connect as myself, I can connect as the SPN. And I can run other dbatools commands so I can get the users on my instance. We'll have a look at the master instance, and you can see that the users I've got are the SPN and system ones. And in fact, if I looked at all of the databases on the instance, which I can do with my SPN, I've got nothing. This time I've excluded those system users. So if I do that, then I can actually add myself to this database. To do that, I need to change database context. Now, within a connection against Azure SQL Database, I can't use a use database statement. So I have to create a new connection. So I'm going to create a new connection, still with the same credential, same tenant ID, same trust server certificate. But this time I'm going to connect to the Beard app 1 database. That's going to create me my connection. And then I need to run some T-SQL because dbatools unfortunately doesn't have the capability to add contained users to Azure SQL Database. So I'm going to create a user, my user, from external provider, and then I'm going to add that to the role data reader and data writer. So run that query using this connection. And I thoroughly expected that to fail. Okay, let's see if it really has connected. So I will need to change to a database Beard app 1. That's where I gave myself my permissions. I'm going to press connect. Ta-da! Now I have the ability to connect to this particular database. It doesn't have any tables in it. So the reason I expected it to fail is because there's one further step. And it's quite interesting because it means that the instance from my previous test run this afternoon has actually kept these permissions. Now it's important here. This requires an Azure Premium P1 license to be able to assign groups to roles. So normally what we have to do is we need to add the directory reader permissions. So I'm going to open up the Microsoft site and just do Azure SQL. When it fails, it gives you the link in the error message, which enables you to go and find what you need to do. So we need to assign our directory readers role to an Azure AD group, and that will enable us to add it. So this is how you would do that within the portal. They've also got some PowerShell further down here. But the important point to realize when you're doing this is that a global administrator or a privileged role administrator will need to run these initial steps. So if you're working without a premium P1 license, somebody who has those roles is going to have to add every single server identity to have that directory reader's role. A better option, especially in a big corporate environment, is to get somebody with a global administrator or a privileged role administrator permissions to create a group and enable somebody else to be able to add the servers into that group, so that then you can have the permission to be able to do it. Because obviously, if the SQL instance can't read Azure Active Directory, it doesn't know if that's a real account or not. So, having added our directory reader permissions, I'm going to disconnect my connection, and I'm going to disconnect my Azure SQL, my SPN connection to master as well. And I'm going to recreate that. And you remember we only had 2 users available. Now we should have, once the internet works, there we go. So database Beard app 1, we've got my user account. Excellent. And let's see which role members we've got. So again, these are using two dbatools commands, get db user and get db role member. And as we can see, we've got, let's make that big there, make it a bit easier. So in Beard App 1, in data reader role, we've got a kitten and Rob's username and the data writer role as well. So excellent. Code has worked as we expected. It's really cool because if I can use dbatools to create users and give them permissions in the roles, then I can do this programmatically. So let's minimize this region. And we're just going to connect to each one of the databases individually so that we've got the capability to add users to each of those databases. And then I'm going to do this. So as well as being able to make this sort of management, we want to have some sysadmins, some people who can control this, who can maybe fix something at 3 o'clock in the morning. And in Azure SQL Database, you can't add a sysadmin role. You can use a sysadmin, an administrative account, but to have a sysadmin role, as it were, is not possible because you don't have access to all of the underlying SQL instance. You only have access to the databases. So what we have in the master database are two roles called DB manager and login manager. So what we're going to do is going to just create a query that runs in master. It's going to create the user and it's going to add them to that role. Once we do this, if I then go and make a connection, make a new connection, and this time I'll go into the master database. And now I can see all of the databases. So here I'm only connected to Beard App 1, the one database I'm a contained user in. But here is my connection to master with the 2 extra roles, and I can see these 3 databases. So if I was to go into this database, that's fine. I can see what's happening here, see all of the users. But if I try to go into the audit database, I don't have any permissions there. So I get a failed to connect, login failed for user. So I'm getting an error. I can't access this database, but I can add permissions to it. So again, we'll just check our permissions. We can see I've got permissions in the master database. So I think we've connected to those. So let's do something like this. It's a bit of fun. I'm just going to run this piece of code. Hopefully some of you are going to recognize some of these names that are going through here. So you see we've added all of these people to various databases on our instance. Now, if I disconnect all of my connections and then do this, I'm going to get all of my users on all of those databases. And as you can see, now for Beard App 1, I've got John Morehouse and Sean Melton and Chrissy Lemaire and Mrs. Father Jack, and bigger on Twitter, Catherine Wilhelmsen, all have permissions. We've got Ben Weisman and Ree Irish and Bob Pisteri and Anthony Containers, Monica and Joey. Audit database has got Drew and Johan. Reporting database has got all of these people. And I've got my admins as well, the ones I trust. Gianluca, Andre and William, Argenis and Father Jack. Added all of those users just programmatically, and it took, how long did it take? Let's have a look. It took 5.78 seconds. Excellent. So that's really good. So let's just drop all of those as well, because sure, that was a bit of fun. And really, it was just done by picking up some, oops, that's the drop rock. Let's look at the add. There we go. It was just done by, if the username was in this, then add them, just for a bit of fun. So I thought, well, I could do it like this. I can put this into code. Here is one way of enabling this. But wouldn't it be better if, good, they're all disconnected. Wouldn't it be better if we did something like this? Let's open this repository. Grab this repository. And within there, I've got a permissions folder, and it's got deploy permissions, and it's got a SQL instance Excel sheet. In the SQL instance Excel sheet, I've got a front page, which says Azure SQL Database permissions. This workbook is used to apply the required permissions. A list of instances, I've got a list of databases, and I've got a list of roles with some descriptions in. And these are used to fire the next page. Got all of my logins. So if I wanted to have a login, then I can make sure that this is added and created here. If I want them to be an admin, I can make it true, or if I just want to create a contained user, I can make it false. And it's as simple as doing something like this. Pick a list, it's a drop down. We can add a user. I haven't got another user to add, I just remember that. And then we can decide whether it's an admin or not. So I'm going to just delete that one, save. And then in the databases, exactly the same thing. So I could pick a new database, add it to the table. It's going to be on this instance. We'll go to pick beard reporting, and I've got all of my users that I've already created. So let's add Drew. We'll add Drew to the reporting database, and we'll make him a security admin, because there aren't any other security admins. It'll be easy for us to see. Let's save this. And this is something that I created for a client because they like to work with Excel sheets. It's something that made sense to them. I think it would have been better to hold it within a database, but then there's more issues about how we keep that under source control. We didn't want to work with. Having created this Excel sheet and made our changes, I'm going to go to source control. I see I've got my changes. I'm going to stage my Excel sheet. I'm going to say, let's call it request 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, added true to reporting because it's X. And we'll add that one. And then we're going to push our changes up. And that's going to go. I'm going to look at this deploy permissions YAML file, which is going to create our Terraform. This time, we're going to trigger on master. We're going to include the permissions directory. Got a few variables. We need to get our IP again. We need to add our rule. We also need to add a SQL Server firewall rule. And then we run this deploy permission script. And then we remove our two firewalls. Very simple pipeline. And our deploy permission scripts does pretty much the same thing. We make sure we've got our dbatools and our import Excel module. That's what gives us the ability to read and or write, if we wanted to, from Excel sheets within PowerShell. And then we read our Excel logins and our database permissions, our roles, and we create exactly the same thing. Of course, I've added in some if exists because we don't want to get those failures coming through. And same with the database users and our role memberships. But we want to make it idempotent. So the other thing that we want to do is to say, well, let's make sure we've got everything that we're expecting. So we're just going to write a warning out if we haven't got our login. Could have written a pester test, but I wanted to keep it all in the one place. And then I want to check that the users that are in Excel, that there aren't any in the database there. So if we remove a user from Excel, it'll get removed from the database. Just use remove DBA user for that. And equally the same with the roles. If there is a role, if a user is no longer a member of a role, if we've removed that from the Excel sheet, then we want to remove them from that role programmatically. So pushing that code up will have set off another pipeline. Here it is, SQL deploying permissions, added Drew to reporting because he's ace. Let's have a look and see what's happening. As you can see, here is the results of our deployment. So we're adding some users. Remember, we had no users at all. We removed all of our users. And we are adding them to the roles as well. And oh, look at that. Just as we get there, we're at the bottom adding Drew Ferguelli to the DB security admin role in database beard reporting. Brilliant. So that's going to run through, and then it's going to remove the firewall rule. So there we go. In 3/4 of an hour, I've shown you how to build Azure SQL Database with Terraform. Talked about variables. Talked about state files and how important they are. How you should use tags to make sure that other users don't make changes that you don't want them to. We've looked at the code within our Terraform file, seen how you can search for how to find out how to create your own resources. Talked about when you create your Azure SQL Database, to be able to have your SPN to be able to create Azure Active Directory users, you need to do two things. You need to make sure that when you create your SQL server, that it has an identity in Azure Active Directory. So you can do that with PowerShell, or you can do that in Terraform. You can do it to an existing Azure SQL database as well. And you also need to ensure that your Azure SQL server has the directory reader permission, because it needs to be able to read the Azure Active Directory to be able to see whether those users are allowed. And that requires a high permission. So the best practice is to create a group and then enable somebody to put those servers into the group. Now my job is finished. So if we go back to some code, we could just run this one. And in fact, what I might even do is get the role member. Let's do the role member instead. And we'll do that. Oh, and we don't want to exclude system DB users, do we? If we're doing this, we might just do a format table. So you never code when you're never type live when you're demoing, or always do it because it's kind of fun. Let's see what happens when we get there. There we go. There's all of our users created from an Excel file that we then pushed up in code, ran through our Azure database. So we get, there we go, 21 seconds to get those. So my name is Rob Sewell. Thank you very much indeed for listening. If you have any questions, please feel free to write to me, to connect with me. You find me on Twitter, SQL DBA with Beard.